I was toying with the idea of giving a different lecture to the one I'm going to give tonight, just for variance sake, because I gave this lecture last night in Aberdeen, but then I thought you might be missing out on something and somebody will undoubtedly at some point complain that they haven't had full coverage. So I will stick with yesterday's script, so to speak. I think it does the job, because what I want to try and get across is essentially, if nothing else, what archaeology can bring to our understanding of the First World War. You may ask yourself, a conflict that is literally only 100 years old, that we have huge documentary resources for in the form of war diaries, photographs, aerial photographs, books galore. What can archaeology possibly offer? Well, I believe through experience a lot. And what I want to do tonight is to give you 3 brief case studies that will hopefully give you some idea of the variety of archaeology that is being done on the First World War. All of these are centred on the Western Front, by the way. And the benefits to scholarship to be had from it. And I will be discussing the Fromell project, which Anne mentioned in the introduction there. But why the First World War and why archaeology? Well, the issue struck home to me back in 2008 when I was privileged to spend 3 days in the company of the man sat down in that photograph. Harry Patch was the last man to have fought in the First World War. He's famous as the last fighting Tommy. He was injured in combat in the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, when 3 of his close friends were killed in front of him by a German shrapnel shell. And in 2008, he returned, that photograph is taken in Ypres, he returned to Flanders to unveil a monument at the place that he went over the top in 1917. Now, it was like following Elvis around, really, because everybody knew who he was and he was a celebrity. Unfortunately, he wasn't going to be around for too much longer. In that photograph, he's 110 years old. And Harry didn't start to talk about his experiences of the war until he was 100 years old. And he was quite amusing about it because he used to get a bit hacked off about the fact that everybody was really interested in the 6 months he was involved in the First World War before being invalided out. But nobody gave a damn about the 50 years he spent as a plumber and joiner, which he was very good at. And interesting insight there into kind of the nature of human biography. But Harry died the following summer after just making the 111-year-old mark. A phenomenal individual, but with his passing, it became obvious to me that we had lost the last living bridge to the events of the Western Front. It was our last link gone. And from then on, everything would really rely on historians and indeed archaeologists and projects like Dundee's project, the project I'm running at Glasgow University, to keep these memories alive. And hopefully, with that little bit of background, what I'm about to show you will make more sense than it might otherwise. Now, I first want to discuss the Battle of Fromell, which in Britain, certainly prior to the project I'm going to outline here, was little known. Better known in Australia due to the scale of Australian losses. But this was fought on the 19th and 20th of July 1916. And it involved the Australian 5th Division, of which 5,500 men were killed in action, went missing, were wounded or captured. And also men of the British 61st Division, of which around 1,500 were killed in action or wounded. And their German enemy were a Bavarian regiment, 6th Reserve Regiment, and they lost around about 1,000, maybe 1,500 men. We're not even too sure. But they do have fairly good archives because they are Bavarian in Munich. Because those Munich archives survived Allied bombing in World War II, which the archives in Berlin did not. And one reason why our own British First World War record is not complete is because the Germans reciprocated in the Second World War and bombed London and destroyed many of the records of individuals who were involved in the First World War. So that's one reason why we need to look to other means to more fully understand these events. But what about the Battle of Fromelles? Well, it was an Allied attempt to take pressure off the line further south. Fromelles is located not far south from the Belgian border in French Flanders, and at this time, around 40 or 50 miles further south in Picardy, the Battle of the Somme, which we will all have heard of, was going very badly, famously starting off disastrously on the 1st of July of 1916. And some bright spark came up with the idea of putting in basically a diversionary attack further north to keep the Germans in that sector busy and to prevent them from reinforcing the line where the main assault was going in. It was very soon after decided it probably wasn't that great an idea, but nonetheless the attack went ahead, partially because the Australians were quite keen to do it, because this is the first action of Australia on the Western Front. And as a nation, they were incredibly keen to prove their mettle in battle. And it's for that reason that today you not only see tens of thousands of Australians visiting Gallipoli, but increasing numbers visiting from Fromelles. It's become a place of pilgrimage. And this photograph shows 8 of those newly arrived Australians. Ironically, they were put in this position because it was quiet. They were put here to acclimatise. Some of these men had come from Gallipoli via Egypt, and so were not obviously used to the climate, shall we say, of northwest Europe. Little did they know that within weeks they would be thrown into the maelstrom of battle, but they were keen to be there. And perhaps some of that eagerness is starting to dissipate in the faces of these men. This photograph is said to have been taken not very long at all before they went over the top into no man's land. And it is said of this photograph that only one of those 8 survived. And the man who survived is the man in the foreground with a cigarette in his mouth. So when somebody tells you that smoking kills, it's not always the case. He's the exception that proves the rule. On the other side, Bavarian regiment, which numbered among its personnel a young Adolf Hitler. I've got lots of stories to tell you about Adolf Hitler at Fromelles, but unfortunately not the time to tell them. And what you see here are men digging a dugout into the crypt of the church of Fromelles village, which sits on a ridge overlooking the area we're going to be looking at in some detail. And when you first look at that photograph casually, it looks as though the church is fairly intact. But if you peer through the window, you will see that it's nothing but a shell-shattered facade. And you can tell these men are Bavarian because the officer there on the right is smoking a nice big curly pipe and has big whiskers. But nonetheless, despite their appearance, these were incredibly hard fighters and proved themselves in the Battle of Fromelles. Now, this was a battle which really brings to the fore all of those stereotypes that revisionist historians are trying so hard to sweep aside as far as the First World War is concerned. This was lions led by donkeys. It was a poorly conceived attack with no firm objectives, and it was a waste of human life. Now, prior to the assault, there was a very heavy artillery barrage. There was no surprise element whatsoever because the Germans on the higher ground could see all of the guns being drawn up for the assault. They could see men being brought into the trenches, ready to go over the top. And so what they did when the artillery barrage began was to take shelter in their very well-constructed concrete bunkers. They simply waited for the barrage to end and then dragged out their machine guns, and as British and Australian troops walked over no man's land towards them, they opened fire and cut them down, as one Australian veteran survivor said, knocked them out like teeth from a comb. And this photograph is taken from the German position on the battlefield. That blurred thing in the foreground there is German sandbagging, So it's taken behind their parapet. The ground here is incredibly wet, and you only need to get within a couple of feet of digging before water starts to come up from the high water table. And what you're seeing running off there is a drainage ditch. And some of the Australians, despite this heavy machine gun fire, managed to get into the German front line, fight their way through it, and even into reserve areas where they desperately sought a reserve line, but that was too far away. And some of them overnight even ended up trying to defend ditches like that. And it was as they tried to get back to their lines the next day that many of them were either killed or captured. Now you can see the Allied front line on the skyline. That's a sandbag parapet. So you can't dig deep, so you build up. So they built up these parapets out of sandbags, millions of which came from Dundee, from the jute factories. Now you can see the nature of the terrain. No man's land between the two positions is flat as a pancake. And each one of those sad bundles in the middle distance is a dead Australian soldier, fallen exactly where he was shot. You can see they're in lines, they're advancing in echelon, and they've just fallen without getting anywhere near the German positions. Though miraculously, as I've said, some of them did. And very nasty hand-to-hand fighting took place in the frontline trenches. It's recorded that one German alone threw between 200 and 300 stick grenades at close quarters, a weapon designed for use in the trenches. He was invalided out of the line because he couldn't throw any more. He essentially developed tennis elbow. After the battle, somebody had to clean up. And given that there were dead men, both German and British and Australian, in the front line of the German position, it was them that took on the task. They actually asked for a ceasefire from the Allies so that the dead could be collected. Allied commanders denied that ceasefire. An incredibly pragmatic attitude to war. And so the Germans complaining that once again they were left to clean up the British mess, or the English as they describe them. Didn't matter whether you were Australian, Scottish or English. To the Germans you were English in this instance, because we have these documents. And what we have is a burial order from a major on the Bavarian side, which in very great detail lays out the instructions as to how his own men are to deal with the Allied men and bury them with full due care and attention. And this is to take place behind their lines, behind an area called Pheasant Wood. Bodies are to be delivered on a light railway. All forms of identification are to be removed from individuals, placed in a sack, and those sacks, clearly labelled, sent to the Red Cross in Switzerland. And because of that German efficiency, within weeks, relatives in Australia and Britain knew that their loved ones had died in this battle. It was a privilege that not many people had during the First World War, if you can call it that. But what they didn't know was where they were buried. That was until an Australian school teacher called Glasgow started to harass the Australian government about a location where he thought, through his own researches, mass graves had lain undisturbed and unmarked for 90 years or so since the end of the war. And that was where myself and my team entered the story. But looking at documentation related to this battle, I think these are two of the most, when set side by side certainly, are two of the most profound documents that you could wish to encounter. These are contemporary trench maps. These were drawn up by both sides on the basis of aerial photography, which is a resource we use to try and tie down the location of this site. And what you can see on the slide on the left is the German line marked in red. And that protuberance towards the left, that salient, is known as the sugar loaf. It's there that a lot of killing and dying took place. But you can see added onto that in blue chinograph, there are numbers 15, 16, 19, 37. This is a death map. Those numbers refer to the number of dead that the Germans had collected off the field. And at times they would crawl out under cover of darkness to drag bodies in. Now, one of the reasons that we may not in the UK have heard of the Battle of Fromelles is because of the map next to it. Look at the numbers there. 702, 749. and again and again and again these huge numbers. That is the Battle of the Somme. It speaks volumes about the tragedy of that battle. But nonetheless, at Fromelles, we see within a very short space of time a huge number of men killed, and it's remembered in Australia as the bloodiest day in Australian military history. But where were these dead taken? Well, there is a memorial to them. This is at a place called VC Corner. It's a Commonwealth War Graves cemetery, and it's virtually in exactly the same spot that that first photograph was taken from the German front line. And that wall contains the names of somewhere around 1,500 Australian soldiers killed in the battle, most of them with no known grave. Now, 410 of those names are represented by mass graves in the foreground under those flower beds. We don't know who they were, but there are 410 of them in there in communal graves. Now, Lambis and Glazos, who has no biological connection to this battle, he has no ancestry related, but visited the site some years ago and became very emotionally involved in the idea that there were lost Australians lying out in the landscape with no memorial marker or identity. And he started a campaign to get the Australian government to go out and look for these men. Now, the thing is that since 1921, none of the Commonwealth powers has followed actively the search for any of the hundreds of thousands of men missing after the Great War. That search for bodies in temporary graves, in shell holes, in trench graves, in temporary cemeteries outside of field hospitals stopped in 1921. And since then, even though every year bodies will be recovered by accident due to building work, etc., there has been no governmentally financed project to seek out these graves. So this was one reason why the Australians were not really keen to pursue this. But Lambis would not be quieted, and eventually myself and the historian Peter Barton were brought in to try and bring this story to fruition, or at least establish to everybody's satisfaction whether Lambis had a case to answer as far as the location of graves in the region of Pheasant Wood were concerned. And so my team and I were commissioned by the Australian government via the Australian Army to go out and do a non-invasive survey. A fuss wasn't to be made, holes weren't to be dug, this was to be done using surface methods only as far as we could. The only holes that we were allowed to dig in 2007 were related to the small holes to recover objects through metal detector survey from the topsoil. So in 2007, out we went, but we didn't go out without having done our homework first. And one of the important sources of information are these aerial photographs taken by the Allies over German positions throughout the war for reconnaissance purposes. This is why we have aerial warfare developing. And these photographs tell a very interesting story. The one in the top left is taken in April of 1916, therefore some time before the Battle of Fromelles. And as you can see, there's not a huge amount of interest on it. The diagonal line running across the frame is a light railway that the Germans used to take supplies from their front line to their reserve areas and vice versa. Pheasant Wood is the dark patch at the top of the frame. There's a zigzagged communication trench, more of later, running down the middle of the frame into the wood from the village on the top of the ridge, which is just off shot. Other than that, there's not much happening. There's one or two shell holes. And the British had made an assault on this ridge, the Aubert Ridge, sometime previously. It had been disastrous for them. But other than that, there's not much happening. But if you turn to the next picture on the right, which is taken on the 29th of July 1916, a week after the battle, you will see there is a dramatic difference. 8 features have appeared in the lee of the wood immediately adjacent to the railway. And if you look more closely, you will see that they are long trench-like holes in the ground, and 5 of them have been backfilled. 3 still remain open, though if you look even more closely, you will notice that the end of one of those seems to have been backfilled. That was an observation we made before we'd gone out into the field. They, we believed, were the grave pits, dug by the Germans adjacent to the railway so bodies could be dragged off the railway and buried behind the cover of the wood. Now, an Australian reburial party visited this location after the war but failed to find anything, which is a little bit of a mystery, but there's possibly a story there of men being distracted by local wine, etc. Slightly controversial, but I'll leave that story for Peter Barnett to tell sometime. But the point is that there seemed to be reason to believe that those graves were still occupied, if that's what they were, by the dead men buried by the Germans. And then if you look at the bottom one, this is from October 1918, and it's the clearest of the photographs, and you can see there very clearly that 5 had been backfilled, and the backfill mounds have been nicely squared off. So what happens here? These were spotted, they're very clear on these aerial photographs, but they appear on trench maps later, and it looks as though they've been misinterpreted as German trench mortar positions. They've been misinterpreted by the analysts. So we looked at these in conjunction with those burial orders and came to the conclusion that there was possibly a case to be made. Hence, we were sent out there into the field by the Australians to examine this area. And there it is, in the flesh. There's Pheasant Wood. The green grass is our search area. It's about 30 metres by 130 metres. Doesn't seem that big, but when you're out there and you can't dig holes, it's big. Ploughed field with crop in it slopes gently up toward the village, and you'll see a picture of the church that you saw in an earlier photograph soon. But the thing is that by the time you get to the flat ground at the bottom of the slope, you're into a very different soil. Sandy soil on the slope allows you to till it and allows you to grow things in it. As soon as you get to the bottom, it's horrible, sticky, plastic clay, and nothing will grow in it. And so it's been left abandoned. That abandonment is nothing to do with the graves. Local people weren't here to witness the battle. The Germans moved them out, and they didn't move back to the village until around 2 years after the war. So they knew absolutely nothing about these events. But if you look closely, what may appear to be a fairly flat field, flat patch of grass, has actually got slight dimples and undulations in it. And we subject those to very detailed topographic survey, which gave us depressions and rises which seemed to correspond to those pits on the aerial photograph. We could even see the ridge that the railway, the embankment that the railway lay across. And we threw everything we had at it. All forms of geophysics. They were fairly pointless because of the clay does not respond well to magnetometry or resistivity or anything else. Though it did give slight traces, but certainly nothing you would go on and say, well, these are grave pits. So we used other means, and unusually for the Western Front, we used metal detector survey. Now you might ask yourself why, because every inch of the ground in this location is covered with debris related to the First World War. In some places there is a geological horizon about 1 metre thick, which is essentially rust from the iron that has fallen from the sky. Such is the impact of those years of combat. But we thought that as we're treating this almost as a crime scene, various forms of evidence might come to light through metal detector survey. And so we started a fairly back-breaking 3-week program of metal detector survey within this search area. And they are all of the objects that we found, mapped to the ground to the square inch. And most of it is just what you'd find anywhere in this vicinity. Shrapnel balls, bits of shell case. But among that, there were 1 or 2 gems that really started alarm bells ringing. And they included distinctive buttons made out of zinc that come off German gas capes, ground sheets for want of a better term. These are just the sort of things that you would use to wrap bodies in, to carry them and bury them. And in fact, von Braun's orders say that you are not to bury the men wrapped in gas capes because it will prohibit, we assume, decay. But these buttons have popped off in the transportation process, and we found them. But other things also came to light, most particularly the object at the top and on the right. These are medallions. I've never encountered their like before, but these are typically Australian. There was no conscription in Australia. Every man that fought was a volunteer. And it was not unusual when you signed up in your local community to be presented by that community with a medallion that basically tells everyone that you have done your duty. And prior to you getting your uniform, you can wear it with pride on your lapel. And indeed, this medallion here has inscripted on it, "For duty done." Now, the one at the top bears a kangaroo and an emu. It doesn't require a rocket scientist to tell you that's probably come from Australia. The one below, the inverted horseshoe, says on it Shire of Alberton. Now, we knew exactly where these came from, and you can see it on that plot. That plot's actually a huge enlargement of one of those aerial photographs. So we could plot these precisely next to the pits from which they came, two opposing pits. It looked very much to us as though these had fallen off men laid down beside the pits prior to being placed in them. Now, if you look at that photograph, you've got the diagonal of the railway. You will see next to the railway that there is a concentration of these buttons. Those buttons find their most heavy concentration at the point where the bodies are being dragged off the railway carriage. They're just popping off through the physical act of that happening. They also include undergarment buttons from Allied soldiers, buttons made in the UK. Now, you see those straight lines running off horizontally and vertically. They are literally the footsteps of the German soldiers who carried out this burial operation. They are the scuff marks created by moving around these long pits. And so we're able, almost on a forensic basis, to plot these objects on a micro basis next to the landscape as it appeared in that week after the Battle of Fromelles. Now, when I got back and we were putting together our report, which was more and more swinging in favour of the fact that yes, these bodies appear to be buried there and certainly still seem to be there. The danger was that the Australians did find them, but we have no surviving record of their recovery. They could be the 410 guys in that mass grave at VC Corner, because von Braun in his orders does say prepare graves for 400 men. So we had to be pretty sure, but by the time we came home, we were fairly confident that these graves had lain undisturbed, and that's what we put in the report. And I stuck my head out, because I did some research on this medallion here from Alberton through the Australian War Memorial, which is a phenomenal resource online, records of every serving Australian soldier. And I worked out there were only 4 men that signed on in Alberton that could have been at Fromelles, and through a process of deduction that I can no longer remember, I worked out that one of those was the favoured candidate. And I even put it in the report and said, this individual may be buried in this pit. It seems rash in the extreme now, but we'll come back to him. And here you can see close-ups. This has actually got Anzac over the top of it. The one up there has AIF in the centre, Australian Imperial Force. It's still got traces of the red, white and blue enamel on it. Now, some of these are left at home, but some men clearly took them with them to the front, possibly as good luck charms. Now, for these 2 men, clearly that good luck ran out at the Battle of Fromelles. Now, the man from Alberton that I suggested was present, thanks to one of those medallions, is this chap, young Harry Willis. 19 years old when this photograph was taken, probably in Egypt. Killed in the battle, and as I said, all the evidence pointed to him being the owner of that medallion. On the basis of that report, the Australian government in 2008 commissioned us to return to Fromelles, and on this occasion we were permitted to dig holes, but only limited holes, 1.5 to 2 metre squares in each of the 8 pits. And we had a shopping list. Our main mission was to discover or verify whether bodies were still present. But beyond that, if they were present, was it possible to identify them by nationality? Were, for instance, they British as well as Australian soldiers? Up until this point, the British government refused to have anything to do with this project. It was seen as an Australian initiative. How many were there? Was it feasible that using DNA we could give these men back their identity? Now these are fairly tall orders given the limited remit of what we were able to do, which was to dig these small test pits and not disturb any of the human remains when we were doing it. But we did our best. However, prior to that we had to find the pits, and this is probably encapsulating the most stressful half day of my professional life. When we arrived on site and we were working with the Australian Army, and I was paired up with an Australian Major General, and every day we had to do a press conference to the press corps who were based in a pen at the end of this enclosure. As you can see, the entire site has been concealed from view, and by the end he was a fairly daunting character, Vietnam veteran. And the amusing thing was that by the end of this, after all these press calls, he thought he was an archaeologist and I thought I was a Major General. We only crossed words once, but it was enough. We worked up, I think, what you would call mutual respect. However, on that first day at 0 hour, and it was done like a military exercise, when we scraped away the topsoil to try and locate the tops of these trenches, of these pits, we couldn't see anything. Just horrible, sticky, orangey brown clay, and I could see my reputation just trickling away through the sweat on my forehead. And we had an amazing team. That, for instance, that person in the white helmet is Gail McKinnon, one of the best forensic anthropologists in the business. She spent 5 years working on 9/11. She's actually an Australian resident in Scotland. So we had geared up to finding bodies, and the thing was that given these conditions, there was the possibility, due to the anaerobic and damp conditions, that these bodies would still have organics on them and not just be skeletons. So we had to be prepared for everything. We also had to be prepared for possibly nothing. However, by the afternoon of the first day, my beating heart began to still a little because we came up with this. Now, to the left of that photograph, you can see what we describe as blue clay. That blue clay should not be there. That should be about 2 meters down. It's clear evidence that this ground has been disturbed and there's been digging. And we've got a straight line. It's the edge of one of the pits. And that straight line calmed my nerves. Because if a body recovery party had been in here and pulled these bodies out, they would not have left a straight edge. They would have cratered this. They would have hacked at it to get these bodies out as fast as possible. They would not operate like archaeologists and chase edges. And if you look even more closely, you will see that there is a scalloped edge to that. Those curves are the backs of the German shovels that dug that ground and threw the earth back in on top of the bodies. As soon as I saw that much, I was fairly confident that these features had not been disturbed since 1916, when they were backfilled by the Germans. And indeed, that was the situation. And in each one of these pits, aside from those 3 that were left open, though even our initial suggestion that one end had been backfilled proved right, there were bodies in there as well. There were bodies. And this is a technical drawing showing individuals because the reality is fairly complex. There was a time when I didn't show the photographs of the originals to anyone else other than my own students. That came as an edict from the Ministry of Defence, because they were concerned that we might be showing pictures of people who could be identified by living relatives through DNA, etc. Because I think people should face up to the realities of this war, and there's no better way than actually looking into the face of these men who were killed. And so I am going to show you a photograph of the reality, but first let's look at this, because it's easier to take in. You have there 2 men lying literally arm in arm. The chap on the left, B12, is about 19 years old. We can tell that from the condition of his skeleton. Von Braun's orders about not burying these men in gas capes has obviously not been followed through, because they are lying in just such a thing. That's what they're lying on. They are fully clothed. Socks, trousers, tunics, all of their webbing and ammunition still intact, unfired. This chap on the right is lying on his front, and he's got with him what looks to be a crutch, a makeshift crutch. And we found evidence in several of the individuals of first aid having been administered to these men before they were actually killed. Some of these men almost died twice We've got photographs from the Germans of forward dressing stations in the German trenches with Australian dead with bandages wrapped around them. And given the congested conditions of burial in these test pits that we were digging, it was very difficult to establish whether there were 2 or even more tiers of the dead. So we had to dig between the bodies where we could. And you can just see here, there's an indication of that. This is a leg on a lower tier. Each and every one of these pits is a double-decker. They've put in a lower layer of bodies. They put in about 30 centimetres of earth with quicklime to sterilise. Von Braun says in his orders, do not just dump the bags of quicklime into the graves. What did they do? They just dumped the bags of quicklime. You've got to imagine what it must have been like for these Germans. These bodies have been lying out in midsummer after being eviscerated by combat, and you can see the damage that combat has caused. Their legs are smashed, their rib cages are smashed by machine gun fire and grenade blast. Their faces have been broken up. This is horrific. Imagine having to carry those bodies, dig the pits in this clay and then put them in it. Of course you're just going to dump the sacks of quicklime in. And there they are. These men, not in the flesh, because the flesh did not survive, to our relief actually, which could have caused all sorts of problems. But we carried out this exercise in full protective clothing, because obviously DNA might be an issue and we didn't want to contaminate. So it's fairly uncomfortable work. Each one of these small pits had a tent over it, so that the press couldn't see what was going on. And you can see there, he's actually got a sack of quicklime between his legs. You see his socks and his trousers. The boots were taken by the Germans because they were better than British boots. You very rarely see a dead British soldier with his boots still on if the Germans have been around. And that tells the story, really. When it sounds strange, but when the pressure got too much with the press and everything else and the politics of this project, I would sneak off and sit in this tent and almost commune with these 3 guys. We almost became chums over the 3 weeks. It may seem morbid and weird, but that was how emotionally this place impacted on me and everybody else in the team. That's just a bit prior to that, actually. You can see there, both sides of that pit. What we did then was carefully take the soil down until we reached the human remains. And because we'd all worked on crime scenes before, we knew what the dead smelled like. And we could smell them before we found them. The miasma of death came up through the clay. And even though the bodies no longer had flesh on them, there was a lot of organic matter. In some cases, it was like a black soup that these bodies were lying in. But I think that's probably enough detail. I think you get the picture. There's another one of these bags of quicklime there. But those plastic bags cover the first human remains we encountered. I think they were the bones of an arm. And so the year following, every one of those men, we managed to fulfill all of our, tick all of our boxes. It was quite clear the bodies were still there. They'd not been touched since 1916. On the basis of material culture and uniform elements, we believe there were some British, but mostly Australian. We came up with a figure of around 175 to 400 bodies on the basis of the limited sample that we looked at. When the bodies were recovered by Oxford Archaeology the following year for individual reburial, it transpired there were bang on 400 bodies. German efficiency again from start to finish. Each one of those men now has an individual grave in a specially established Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery, not very far away from where they were initially buried. And in excess of 150 of those men have now had their identities returned to them through DNA analysis. And I'm proud to say that one of those men was Harry Willis, who was exactly where we said he was. And that's his great nephew and his daughter. And that photograph of Harry now takes pride of place behind my desk in my office. So, moving swiftly along. The theme of this talk is essentially looking at Allied attacks on the Western Front. We've seen how disastrous Fromelles was, how badly directed it was, and how pointless it was. And we all have in our heads those iconic images of the Battle of the Somme, and we've had the controversy recently about the kind of Blackadder effect of the pointless waste of life that took place on the Western Front. Now, is there a way that it could all have been very different? We didn't need to send all of these men across no man's land into the face of German machine gun fire. Well, possibly yes. And this next project gave some indication as to how. You may have seen this one on television. It's the only one of the three that's actually been made into a television programme. And we went out to Picardy, to the Somme, to try and relocate an extinct dinosaur. And that dinosaur was the Lydons flame projector. This is a British secret weapon that was developed for use on the Somme and has disappeared entirely from view. There's not a single piece of it surviving. And so we went out to a place called Mamet in, I can't remember what year, 2010, and searched for this device. Now, it was developed by this chap, Captain W.H. Lydons, who's a Royal Engineer officer who devoted his war to developing weapons of mass destruction. In fact, there's quite a strange story here. His fiancée was due to sail on the doomed Lusitania, which was famously torpedoed by a German U-boat. And after she went down, Lydons made a pact to himself that he would be personally responsible for the death of as many Germans as civilians died on that ship, which was well over 1,000. The fact that his fiancée missed the ship and wasn't on it didn't really change his mind. He still committed himself to that task, and indeed was a bit of an overachiever, I think. Now, you see him stood there next to his most famous device, the Lydons Projector, which was basically a cheap mortar that was capable of launching cylinders either full of poison gas or liquid flame into enemy positions. Now, Lydons was based in the Royal Engineers Depot at Chatham, and so committed to his work was he that at times he would be dragged out by his comrades unconscious from his quarters after gassing himself in his experiments. Needless to say, those experiments were related to the development of poison gas. So he almost killed himself. He went on after the war to actually work on dishwashers and washing machines. So quite an unusual character. He is the death sender. But he also developed this device, the flame projector, which is a massive, massive flamethrower. It's like something out of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And you can see the statistics there. 56 feet long, 2.5 tons. It takes 300 men to carry all the various parts before you can put it together. And the idea is that it sends liquid flame between 75 and 100 meters into enemy positions. And those men that it doesn't incinerate on the surface, it will suffocate underground because it will burn out all of the oxygen from dugouts. It's horrific. But did it work? And did it exist? Well, we know it existed because we've got photographs of it. That's it being tested at Wembley Proving Grounds. But that has it on the surface. This was developed for use underground, and this is where this idea that things like the Battle of the Somme could have been played out in a different way. What if men didn't run over no man's land? They went through tunnels underneath no man's land and popped up, literally in the face of the Germans. That was a plan. Now these tunnels, known as saps, were being dug left, right and centre. Underground warfare, mining warfare was extremely well advanced on both sides by 1916. Planting of mines under enemy trenches, tons of explosives going up underground, blowing men sky high, literally. But this was a new scheme, and the idea here was to deliver weapons systems, including the flame projector and infantry, from underground tunnels. And the idea is that you would first debilitate the enemy by building one of these things underground, and then just a few feet in front of the German positions, like one of these Martian devices from War of the Worlds, the monitor head pops out of the ground and sprays in an arc this liquid fire, like napalm, into the German positions. You then send infantry through and they mop up. It's one of those great what ifs. Because we know that at least in one occasion, two occasions, possibly very close to where we were working at Carnoy, they did deploy these devices successfully. And all of the objectives were met with minimal, almost zero British casualties. Hundreds of Germans captured, frontline trenches taken. But the thing is that the British Army is an incredibly conservative organisation and does not like change. And for one thing, infantry do not go underground. And so this idea was kept essentially to a minimal experiment on one sector of the Western Front of the Somme during the battle. So we, again through my old friend and colleague Peter Barton, he tracked down the archive related to this deployment of these devices via the Royal Engineers War Diaries, which give a day-to-day, hour-to-hour description of what's happening with the various units. And it took us to this place, as I've said, Mehmet. And here are these diary entries. I'll put my specs on to read this to you. This is dated June the 28th, 1916, so clearly in the immediate lead-up to July the 1st. Long and heavily loaded carrying party of Royal Engineers and Devons moving slowly through communication trenches collided with a party of pioneers with picks and shovels in 71st Street, is the name of the trench. Heavy hostile bombardment of trenches occurred at this point. Parts of Flammenwerfer, the flame projector, were dropped and men took cover. Most important parts of Flammenwerfer collected and placed in sap, shallow gallery. So they're trying to deliver all of these parts, to take them underground. They get choked up with other soldiers in the narrow trench, and then out of the blue the Germans start to shell them. And so what they do is they take the most precious parts and just throw them down the entrance to the tunnel in the hope that they're going to be protected. And that is at 5:30 a.m. on the 28th. Story changes at 6 a.m. Heavy shells sealed up end of sap for length of 20 feet, burying vital parts of Flammenwerfer beyond recall. So a shell has come in and basically collapsed that part of the tunnel system that they sheltered these things in. And so that was our starting point. So we located, due to things like this wonderful sketch map of the trench system, where exactly this location was or thereabouts. And you can see marked in green, that is the communication trench that we're talking about, and the area in pink is where we would expect to find the entrance to the sap, and theoretically remains of one of these very rare beasts. And so we went in. There is the area today, absolutely nothing to see unless you go into the woods, where you can still see remains of German trenches, and there's one or two small mine craters. But there's a contemporary map which not only shows the trenches, it also shows the tunnels underground. So we used geophysics, and in this occasion, because we were looking on chalky soils, it was incredibly effective. And using resistivity and magnetometry, we could relocate the trenches in a fairly detailed fashion and overlay, as we have done here, the contemporary trench maps over them. And we thought we'd identified where two of these entrances were. The entrances were always in pairs because it allowed airflow into the system. So you'd have two inclined shafts coming down and then running off it under no man's land. You would have the tunnel or the sap itself. And so we started excavation, and we opened a fairly large area. Fascinating project. We found the front line, which had originally been occupied by the French, then taken over by the British. We found the communication trenches. Everything had been backfilled. There was a huge operation after the war to basically heal the wounds, the scars of the landscape. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese labourers for a start were sent over to backfill the trenches. Farmers were paid by the metre. And you can see there where this chalky soil has been used to fill in 71st Street, this communication trench. There's an area of the front line, perfectly preserved, sandbags and all. That actually shows temporary repair to a part of the front line that's been damaged by shell fire. They've just thrown bags of chalk into it just to block up the void. We did encounter, as we always do in these projects, a lot of live ordnance. We found a dugout full of boxes of hand grenades. We sometimes move these. We work very closely with the local military who specialise in this material, which comes to surface all the time. And we also have our own UXO people on these projects. But these grenades were incredibly unstable, so after moving a few of them, we decided, no, we're just going to backfill that hole and forget about it. Quite wisely, I think. I have had people on projects where we have moved, for instance, 12-pounder shrapnel shells in fairly good nick, moved them to a cordoned area in what we call the Walk of Death, put them on sandbags and left them to be picked up by the demonage people, only to be reported when we get back to work after a weekend off on a Monday morning that a guy came around in a car and threw 3 of them in the back and drove off. This is why people get killed. This is why that house in the south of England was raided by the police several weeks ago. It's Darwin Awards writ large. The problem was that we went in here quite naively. We expected, because we'd done it before, to get underground. We expected to be able to get into these tunnels. What we didn't realise was that after this operation was over, those areas that were still accessible, i.e. that hadn't been shelled by the Germans, were cannibalised. The sappers went in and they removed all of the pit props that kept these structures upright, the roofing, everything. They pulled it all out for reuse. And obviously the net result of that is that hundreds of tons of soil just goes whoosh and seals it. There's nothing there. There's not even a void. There's nothing. And you can see that on the photograph on the right, where all you've got is a colour change. What that might have been at some point is the photograph on the left, where you've got a man in a trench and then a doorway next to him. That's the entrance to one of these inclines going into the sap. So the sap that we thought we would be able to use for access no longer existed, the incline. So we had to return to the one that had been destroyed by the Germans, because the chances were that that had not been cannibalised, because it wasn't worthwhile. It was buried, it was destroyed as far as the Royal Engineers were concerned. And so, as a plan of what we found, see there are 2 bodies marked in the centre. We found 2 dead, buried French Marines, probably black Africans from Algeria or Senegal, buried with everything in full uniform, their backpacks, their rifles, everything. And we recorded them and exhumed them, and they were taken away by the French authorities and buried with full military honours, I'm pleased to say. But that gives you some idea of the complexity of the system that we're looking at. And if I can get this maybe to work. Oh, yes. The SAP system that had collapsed was at the end of 72nd Street. Remember, it's 71st Street that the thing was delivered along. So having given up in this area, we returned to 71st Street, and we did find the smashed up and charred entrance to this incline. And very quickly, once we started to focus there, we started to come up with bits. These don't look like much, they're just G-claps, but they play a vital role. They are used to connect bits and pieces of this machine together. And we even have the manuals, which have each and every piece numbered. And as you can see, they're parts 31. And we've got about 8 of them. That's simply a bag that had just been dropped right near the entrance. But then as we move into the entrance, we excavated the whole thing. We excavated all 20 feet that had been destroyed by the Germans. And as you can see, it has survived. It survived like the twisted spine of a dragon, just going down into the earth, where we could even work out where the shell had come in to this position, into here, and blown. The shock wave had gone in this direction and just collapsed the entire structure. So you've got 2 vertical walls and a roof. And it's just folded it together like the leaves of a book. So whatever was placed in there, theoretically, will still be in there. Down at the bottom, there would have been a chamber with the other incline coming in from this direction, and the sap, the tunnel, running off under the no man's land in that direction. But all of that, as I've said, is gone, because they've cannibalised, they've reused the timber. But all of this, thanks to the Germans blowing it up, has survived. And you can see today's Royal Engineers doing the job. And right inside the entrance we found this, which was the most dramatic piece. It's actually two pieces bolted together. Its part numbers 280 and 271. And in tribute to British engineering, if you turn that today, after 90 years underground, the valve still moves up and down. The only bits that have shown any decay are the iron nuts and bolts. It's made out of gunmetal. But that is a vital piece. That controlled the flow of the fuel through the entire mechanism. And then at the bottom of this structure, because we wanted to preserve as much as we could, so we didn't empty the whole thing, we found two of these. These are the tubes that run along the bottom, parts 163 to 168, that would again carry liquid fuel. And at the end of the day, what we had done is bring out of extinction something that we didn't have any physical evidence for whatsoever, but also in the process managed to tell the story of exactly what was intimated in those few lines in those war diaries. Now the Royal Engineers, being the Royal Engineers, weren't going to be satisfied with that, so they went away to build their own at Chatham, and this is it being fired on their proving grounds. Those buildings that you can see in the foreground there, that's a dummy Afghan village that they were using to train UXO guys in for removing makeshift explosives from. But we built this thing, and I worked out that we fired in about 8 seconds enough fuel to keep a jumbo jet in the air for about half an hour. It was on television. I thought, I'm surely going to get complaints about the waste, the wanton waste, and our carbon footprint. But no, everybody loved it. It burnt off my eyebrows quite literally, and it turned the earth to tarmac. It was absolutely horrific. And this is probably not as effective as the one that Lydons developed himself. Since then, those parts have been on display in numerous French museums. A local technical college built a third scale model of it, quite beautiful thing. So the legacy of that project still lives on. Now I'm going to finish off with a rather more low-key project, but it's actually one of my favourites. We've probably done in total about 6 or 7 projects on the Western Front. This one again returns us to the Australians. We can't escape the Australians, lovely people as they are. On the basis of the work at Fromelles, the Australian government was interested in building a heritage trail along the Western Front, which took in areas that they took part in. And one of them was the Battle of San Quentin, which in late August and early September of 1918 was the site of a battle which really started to see the turning of the tide. This is the end of the long summer in 1918 when the Allies really get their act together, and using combined arms of targeted artillery, tanks, infantry and aircraft, they start to learn how to defeat the Germans on the Western Front and push them back. And this is one of the more dramatic strong points that were taken as part of that campaign. That's a contemporary painting showing Mont San Quentin with the picturesque ruins freshly created of the village in front and the shell-shattered remains of the wood on top. That was the target for the Australian attack. It had been occupied, that hilltop had been occupied by the Germans quite comfortably and without risk since 1914. The Allies had never come anywhere close to it. And if any of you have visited the Western Front, you will know, coming from Scotland, how boring the relief is. When we talk about high ground in Flanders and on the Somme, it's not really very high at all. But this, relatively speaking, is a proper hill. And so a natural strong point for the Germans, who are very, very good at identifying the terrain that's going to be of value to them. And here you see it on a Google photograph. There's the town of Peronne, the river Somme arcing around it. So the Allies are on this side of the Somme. The Germans are in the town and on the hilltop. And as I said, have been on that hilltop since 1914, which is part of the story. And this map demonstrates that. You've got all of the advances made by the Allies through the long Battle of the Somme from July to November of 1916, but they come nowhere near. There's a kink where Peronne and Mont San Quentin are, remains firmly in German hands. And if you stand on top of the hill, you can see why. There is the view that you get. There's the river coming through below, Allied positions over here. You can see for miles. And so there was no way that any attack here was going to be a surprise attack. Similar to Fromelles, but even more dramatic as far as the German position is concerned. And so for days, if not weeks prior to this assault taking place, the Germans knew it was coming. And that foreknowledge is an important part of the story here. There is a trench map from 1916, November 1916, showing the town. And if the 18th century is your bag, you will see it's got a beautiful Vauban fort around it. I try not to get too excited about that. Then we've got the village of San Quentin and trench systems, German front line, secondary, communication trenches, a big HQ at the back of the wood on the top of the hill, and all sorts of stuff going on. But notice, this is our search area up here in the wood. There's only one trench shown running through the wood on that map. And that trench can still be seen today. But put this in a bit more context. This attack was the brainchild of General Monash in the Australian 2nd Division. And they were to cross the Somme on the eve of the 30th of August, and then on the 31st storm the hill. A few hiccups, they had problems getting across the river, problems with manoeuvring light field artillery, but they got across and did storm up that hill, and there are German accounts that the Australians yelled like banshees as they careened up the hill. A lot of Germans actually dropped their weapons and skedaddled, and so the Australians managed to fight their way up to the top of the hill and into the wood beyond the village. And there you see photographs of them, possibly in a lull in the fighting in some of these trenches. These are fairly makeshift trenches, they're communication trenches, they're designed to do nothing but give men shelter as they move from one area to another. These are not fighting trenches, just carved into the chalk. And in great Dad's Army fashion, I'll show you this map with arrows on it. We've got 3 battalions of Australians charging up the hill, getting to the top, through the village, into the edge of the wood, and indeed beyond. But then a German Guards regiment, elite troops, comes back and throws them off the hill. But that counter-attack isn't effective for very long, because the Australians come screaming back up and take the hill. And once they've taken the hill, along with the help of the British, they take the town of Peronne in the days that follow. So, to return to our wood, that's what you see if you walk through it today. You can still see the trench preserved because it's not farmland. There's been no point in backfilling it. So, you can use your imagination and see that if you take away that scrub and move out some of the silt, you've got fairly much the trenches that you were seeing in those photographs. Interestingly, if I'd pay more attention, I'd have reframed this photograph. A lot of these trees are actually double trunked, and we were told that the double trunk is a tree's response to having been decimated by a shell. It throws out a secondary trunk. So a clear indicator that this place had suffered shell fire. But what surprised us when we started the project, again returning to, this is from December 1916, this is actually the last map created during the war, and again, very clearly, just one trench. When we did our detailed topographic survey, which took in every shell hole in the wood, every nook and cranny, lo and behold, there are 2 trenches. What's that about? There's this one on the bottom, which is the trench on the map. Then there's this one, just a few feet away, running all the way along it, mirroring it, but not quite. There's a subtle difference between the two. This one is fairly straight. Give or take 1 or 2 sinews. That, if there's going to be an attack and an artillery assault, is a death trap. It is not fit for purpose, because if a shell lands there, the blast is going to run all the way up there and all the way up there and kill anybody within range. It doesn't do anything to dissipate blast. And this is what I'm saying about the Germans being complacent on this hilltop. They were having a high old time up there. Fairly easy posting. But then, when they get wind of this Australian attack, they start to get nervous. And they dig another trench. And that trench, as you can see, is classically zigzagged. And each one of those zigzags will dissipate blast if a shell lands in it. And it will only allow that blast to rip up a few feet of trench. It's straight out of the manual. Now, there is no record of that action taking place, of somebody making the decision damn it, they're coming up here and this trench is going to be a death trap, let's dig another. That's purely archaeological endeavour which has given us that interpretation. It's added that amount of knowledge to this battle. We have no record of it whatsoever. But that's not all. As I've said, we plotted every shell hole. Now these small ones are Australian artillery incoming, 12-pounder shrapnel shells. We've got bits and pieces from them all over the place. These shell holes down here, some of which have landed in the trenches, are much bigger. That's because they're German. And we can tell that, for one thing, there is my colleague Dr. Banks in some of these trenches. Not the most exciting things to dig. Just ditches cut through the chalk. I think the most exciting, other than the bits and pieces I'm going to show you, were telephone wires running through the bottom of them. There we have pieces of two different shells. The one on the bottom right is beautiful brass. Copper ally, it's lovely, it's British. It's the time fuse of a 12-pounder shrapnel shell. That grottier piece at the top is German. And we can tell it's German because it's got this horrible decayed zinc in it. Now, as with those buttons at Fromel that were made of zinc, if you find zinc, there's a 99.9 chance it's German, because due to the British naval blockade, the Germans ran out of good metal. And wherever they could, they had to use grotty iron or alloys like zinc. So buttons, rather than being of brass, are zinc. Fuses on shells are zinc. So if you find that horrible decayed white metal, you know what you're looking at is German. That for us was really useful because we could go, that shell hole is Australian, that one is German. And so we were able, on a micro scale, to rebuild the picture of Australian incoming and then, importantly, German counterfire. And what the Germans have done is that they've actually bracketed, they've ranged their guns on their own positions. So their heavy guns way behind the lines have come in and they've peppered the brow of the hill, because by then the Australians are in these positions and they want them out, and they've cleared them out with this heavy artillery. And again, it's an event which has no documented historical record. It's purely forensic archaeology that's told us that. And further to this trench being dug, it becomes quite clear to the Germans that the attack is by and large going to come in this direction. And so what they've done, they've actually laid wire along this communication trench just outside, and we found all the way along through metal detector survey that the iron pickets used to support the wire, and also enough lengths of it to be able to reconstruct quite a heavy wire entanglement. What they've done there is they've turned what is a reserve trench in a very well protected position into a frontline fighting trench. And we found the bullets from both sides in this area where close quarter combat has taken place between the two sides. So using archaeology on a site that we know about, we know the broad sweep of history, we know what happened, we have accounts from both sides, but we focused on an area and identified information for which we have no written record whatsoever. And to my mind, that is a really compelling argument for doing archaeology on the Western Front. Now, I do not agree with all the archaeology that's done on the Western Front. Archaeology is here to ask and answer questions. It's not just to go out and dig up stuff because you know it's there and you can find cool things. That is treasure hunting. It's not archaeology. But I hope I've demonstrated that in these three cases at least, we're looking at archaeology with a firm research footing with positive and meaningful results. Thank you for listening.